The people who predict your future with the greatest confidence are often the ones who have never taken the time to understand your journey. I learned that lesson on a quiet Sunday evening around my parents' dining table, surrounded by familiar faces, warm food, and words that would stay with me for years. My name is Jacob Carter, and for most of my adult life, my parents believed I was the child who would never truly become anything. I was 33 years old, lived in a modest apartment outside Columbus, Ohio, drove a dependable pickup truck with more miles than I cared to count, and worked as a records coordinator for a regional historical preservation foundation. My job did not come with a prestigious title, a large office, or an impressive salary. I spent my days organizing archives, protecting legal records, preserving old property documents, and helping families recover pieces of their history that might otherwise have disappeared forever. I loved the work because it mattered, even if very few people understood why. Unfortunately, my parents measured success differently. My father, Thomas Carter, had spent nearly 40 years building a respected construction business from the ground up. He believed success could be seen in large houses, expensive vehicles, executive offices, and business headlines. My mother, Linda Carter, never intended to hurt me, but she often agreed with my father because she believed he simply wanted the best for his children. My older sister, Emily, had become a successful financial advisor, and family gatherings usually became opportunities to celebrate her newest achievements while quietly comparing them to my much less impressive career. I never blamed Emily because she never participated in those comparisons, but I always felt them hanging in the air between every conversation. That evening began like dozens of family dinners before it. My mother prepared her famous pot roast with mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, homemade dinner rolls, and warm apple pie cooling on the kitchen counter. The smell filled the entire house, reminding me of every holiday and birthday I had celebrated growing up. For a little while, everything felt comfortable. We laughed about childhood memories, discussed neighborhood changes, and talked about the upcoming county fair. Then my father asked the question I had heard many times before. "So, Jacob, any big plans for your career?" I smiled politely. "Things are going well. We have started a new preservation project with several county offices, and I have been helping organize thousands of historical property files." He nodded without much interest. "That sounds organized." Emily quickly tried to change the subject, but my father continued. "I just keep wondering when you are finally going to do something with your potential." The room became noticeably quieter. I placed my fork on the plate and answered calmly, "I enjoy what I do, Dad." He leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Enjoying something is not the same as building a future. My mother looked down at her plate, while Emily stared toward the kitchen window. Neither wanted the conversation to continue, but everyone knew it would. "You were always a smart kid," my father said. "You could have become an attorney, an executive, maybe even started your own business. Instead, you spend your days filing old paperwork that nobody even knows exists." I took a slow breath before responding. "Those records matter to the families who need them." He sighed heavily. "Maybe, but that is not exactly the kind of career people dream about." I remained silent because experience had taught me that arguing never changed his opinion. My father interpreted my silence differently. "Jacob, I am saying this because I care about you. Right now, if I am completely honest, I do not see much of a future. You have no ambition to build something bigger." His words settled across the dining room with surprising weight. Nobody moved. My mother finally spoke in a quiet voice. "Thomas, perhaps that is enough." He shook his head gently. "No, Linda. Someone has to tell him the truth. Life rewards people who aim higher." I looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Maybe success looks different depending on what someone values." He gave me a sympathetic smile that somehow hurt more than his criticism. "That sounds like something people tell themselves when they settle." Emily finally interrupted. "Dad, Jacob has always worked hard." "Working hard is important," my father replied. "But hard work without direction does not build much of a future." I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I had grown tired of defending a life that already felt meaningful to me. We finished dinner with polite conversation, but the warmth that had filled the house earlier had quietly disappeared. After dessert, I helped my mother wash dishes while Emily gathered leftovers into containers. My father stepped outside onto the back porch with a cup of coffee. I dried the last plate, thanked my mother for dinner, hugged Emily goodbye, and walked toward the front door. Just as I reached my truck, My phone vibrated. The screen displayed the name of an attorney I did not recognize. I almost ignored the call, assuming it was another advertisement, but something prompted me to answer. "Mr. Carter?" the calm voice asked. "This is Michael Reynolds from Reynolds and Pierce Law Offices. I apologize for contacting you on a Sunday evening, but it is important that I speak with you and your immediate family as soon as possible." I frowned in confusion. "Is something wrong?" There was a brief pause before he replied. "A document connected to your family has recently been recovered after being misplaced for many years. I believe every member of your family should be present before it is opened." I looked back toward my parents' house, where the porch lights still glowed against the dark Ohio sky, completely unaware that one forgotten document was about to reveal a truth none of us had ever imagined. I stood beside my truck for several seconds after the call ended, staring at the illuminated windows of my parents' house while trying to make sense of what I had just heard. A recovered family document? An attorney I had never met? A request for every immediate family member to be present? None of it sounded familiar. I looked down at my phone again, wondering if it had been some elaborate mistake, but the number belonged to a respected law office downtown. Before I could decide whether to drive home or walk back. Inside, the front door opened. My mother stepped onto the porch with a container wrapped in aluminum foil. "You forgot your leftovers," she called with her usual gentle smile. I forced one of my own and walked toward her. "Thanks, Mom." She handed me the container, but immediately noticed something different in my expression. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated before answering. "I just received a strange phone call from an attorney." Her eyebrows rose with concern. "An attorney?" Before I could explain further, my father stepped onto the porch holding his coffee mug, while Emily followed behind him. "What attorney?" he asked. I repeated every word the man had told me. My father frowned almost immediately. "That sounds ridiculous. Lawyers call when they want money or when someone made a mistake." Emily crossed her arms thoughtfully. "Did he say what kind of document?" "No," I replied. "Only that it had been recovered after many years and that everyone should be present before it is opened." My mother looked from one face to another. "Recovered from where?" I shook my head. "He did not say." My father gave a short laugh that sounded more skeptical than amused. "This is probably some old paperwork from your grandfather's property taxes or an insurance file that should have been thrown away decades ago." Normally, I would have accepted that explanation, but something about the attorney's calm, deliberate tone stayed with me. He had not sounded like someone chasing paperwork. He had sounded like someone carrying responsibility. Emily finally asked, "When does he want to meet?" "Tomorrow afternoon," I answered. He asked whether we could all come together. My father looked mildly annoyed. "Tomorrow? I have meetings scheduled all afternoon." My mother gently touched his arm. "Thomas, if an attorney says the entire family should come, perhaps we should at least hear him out." He sighed. "Fine. 1 hour. Then I am leaving." We agreed to meet at the law office the following afternoon before everyone went back inside. During the drive home, my thoughts refused to settle. I replayed the conversation over and over, trying to imagine what forgotten document could possibly involve all of us. My grandparents had passed away years earlier. Their estate had already been settled. There had never been arguments over inheritances or family businesses. As far as I knew, every important matter had been resolved long ago. By the time I reached my apartment, it was almost 10 o'clock. I placed the leftovers in the refrigerator, sat down on my old brown sofa, and stared across the quiet living room. The shelves along one wall were filled with books about American history, genealogy, and land records. Most people would have found them terribly boring, but I had always believed that forgotten documents often carried the stories people wished they had never lost. Ironically, I had spent years helping strangers recover pieces of their past without ever imagining that my own family might still have one waiting to be discovered. Sleep came slowly that night. Every possible explanation seemed less convincing than the last. Early Monday morning, I drove to work as usual. The Preservation Foundation occupied a renovated brick building that had once served as the county courthouse. The hallways smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, and the quiet atmosphere always helped me think clearly. My supervisor, Margaret Ellis, noticed my distraction almost immediately. "You look like someone who spent the entire night solving mysteries," she joked. I smiled faintly. Maybe I did. She laughed before continuing toward her office, but I remained unusually distracted throughout the morning. While organizing a collection of 19th century property deeds, I found myself thinking about the attorney's words again. A document recovered after many years. Those words carried unusual precision. People did not accidentally recover important legal documents every day. Around lunchtime, my phone vibrated with a reminder confirming the appointment at Reynolds and Pierce law offices at 2 o'clock. A few minutes later, another message arrived from Emily. "Mom says everyone is still coming." I simply replied, "See you there." I left work early and drove downtown beneath a bright autumn sky. The law office occupied the third floor of an older limestone building, overlooking the courthouse square. It was elegant without being extravagant, with polished brass doors and neatly maintained landscaping outside. When I entered the reception area, I found my parents already seated together while Emily flipped through a magazine she clearly was not reading. My father glanced at his watch as soon as I walked in. "Right on time," he said. "Let us hope this is worth rearranging my afternoon." Before anyone could answer, a receptionist approached us with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Reynolds will be with you shortly. Thank you all for coming together." There was something about the way she emphasized the words together that caught my attention. A few moments later, a man in his early 60s entered the reception area, wearing a navy suit and thin silver glasses. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "I am Michael Reynolds." We introduced ourselves before he shook each of our hands individually. His expression was professional, but there was also genuine kindness in his eyes. "I appreciate your willingness to come on such short notice," he said. "I understand this request may have seemed unusual." My father answered first. "You could say that." Mr. Reynolds acknowledged the remark with a polite nod. "Please follow me." He led us down a quiet hallway into a spacious conference room where a single large envelope rested neatly in the center of a polished oak table. It looked surprisingly ordinary, yellowed slightly with age, its edges softened by time. Yet something about its presence seemed to fill the entire room. None of us spoke as we took our seats. Mr. Reynolds remained standing for a moment before carefully placing one hand beside the envelope. He looked at each of us in turn and finally said, "Before this document is opened, there is something every one of you deserves to know. One person in this room has spent years living without a truth that should never have been hidden." The conference room became so quiet that I could hear the soft ticking of an old clock mounted on the wall behind us. Nobody spoke after Mr. Reynolds finished his sentence. My father slowly leaned forward in his chair, resting both hands on the polished oak table. "What exactly does that mean?" he asked. The attorney looked at him calmly before answering. "It means that the document inside this envelope was never delivered to the people it was intended for. Through a series of filing errors involving a storage company that closed nearly 20 years ago, it remained sealed until a routine archival transfer uncovered it several weeks ago." Those words immediately caught my attention. Filing errors, archival transfers, preserved records. They sounded strangely familiar because they described the very kind of work I handled every day. Mr. Reynolds carefully adjusted the envelope without opening it. When our office received these recovered materials, we began verifying every document before contacting the families involved. Most contained expired contracts or outdated legal notices. This one was different. Emily finally broke the silence. "Different how?" The attorney gave a thoughtful smile. "Because it was accompanied by instructions stating that it must only be opened in the presence of every immediate member of the Carter family." My mother looked genuinely confused. "Who wrote those instructions?" Mr. Reynolds glanced at the front of the envelope before replying. "Your late father, William Carter." The room froze again. My grandfather had passed away nearly 18 years earlier. I remembered him as a quiet man with rough hands from decades of farming, someone who rarely spoke loudly, but always listened carefully before offering advice. He was the person who first taught me that every document represented somebody's life, not just words on paper. When I was 12 years old, he had taken me to the county courthouse and shown me dusty ledgers dating back more than a century. While everyone else considered them old books, he had smiled and told me that every page contained someone's dream, someone's home, or someone's sacrifice. That afternoon changed the way I looked at history forever. I had never forgotten it. My father cleared his throat. If my father left something important, why was none of us notified back then? Mr. Reynolds folded his hands together. "According to our investigation, the attorney handling Mr. Carter's estate retired unexpectedly due to health concerns shortly after these materials entered temporary storage during an office relocation. Several sealed family files were mistakenly transferred into long-term archival storage instead of active probate records. The mistake remained undiscovered until the storage facility permanently closed and every remaining box was reviewed. My father slowly shook his head. 18 years because of one filing mistake. Unfortunately, Mr. Reynolds answered, yes. While rare, situations like this occasionally occur when multiple offices change ownership over long periods. I noticed my father looking at the envelope differently now. His earlier skepticism had faded into genuine curiosity. Emily asked another question. If this was found weeks ago, why wait until now? Because before contacting your family, Mr. Reynolds explained, our office spent considerable time authenticating every signature, every date, and every supporting record. We wanted absolute certainty before disturbing a family with information that could potentially change long-held assumptions. The phrase long-held assumptions lingered in my thoughts. Something about it felt deeply personal. My mother quietly reached across the table and rested her hand beside mine. It was a small gesture, but one I appreciated. She had always tried to keep peace within the family, even when she did not know how. Mr. Reynolds looked directly at me. Mr. Carter, may I ask you a question before we continue? Of course. What inspired your career in historical records preservation? I blinked, surprised by the question. My grandfather. My answer came without hesitation. He believed preserving records meant preserving people's lives. He showed me old county books when I was young. I never forgot that day. The attorney nodded slowly as though confirming something already suspected. I thought you might say that. My father looked toward me with visible surprise. I had forgotten about those courthouse visits. I smiled faintly. I never did. He looked down at the table for a brief moment before speaking again. To be honest, I always assumed you chose that profession because it was convenient. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I looked at the envelope lying only a few feet away. No, I finally answered. I chose it because someone once taught me that preserving forgotten stories matters. My father remained unusually quiet after that. It was one of the few moments in my adult life when he seemed to be reconsidering something he had believed for years. Mr. Reynolds carefully removed a thin folder from beside the envelope. Before opening the original document, I want to establish one important fact. He handed each of us a certified copy of several official records. These are authentication reports prepared over the past month. They confirm the signatures, dates, witnesses, and chain of custody surrounding every item connected with this case. There is no reasonable doubt regarding their authenticity. I looked over the first page. Every certification appeared thorough and professionally documented. As someone who worked with official archives, I immediately recognized the level of detail involved. Whoever had investigated this file had done so meticulously. My father slowly placed the reports back onto the table. So whatever is inside is genuine, Mr. Reynolds answered before he could finish the sentence. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Outside the conference room windows, afternoon sunlight reflected off the courthouse across the street, casting bright patterns across the wooden table. The envelope rested directly in the center of those shifting reflections as though waiting patiently for its moment. Mr. Reynolds finally reached into a small leather portfolio and removed another object. It was an older sealed envelope, smaller than the first, with faded cream-colored paper and handwriting that had clearly been done decades earlier. He held it gently between both hands before placing it beside the larger package. This, he said quietly, was discovered attached to the original file, but completely overlooked during the first probate process. It has never been opened. My heartbeat quickened. My mother softly covered her mouth. Even my father leaned forward without saying a word. Mr. Reynolds looked at each member of our family before resting his fingertips on the untouched seal. According to your grandfather's written instructions, this handwritten letter must be opened first because it explains why the larger document was created in the first place. Mr. Reynolds carefully lifted the small envelope from the table, turning it over once before sliding a letter opener beneath the aged seal with deliberate precision. The faint sound of paper separating seemed unusually loud inside the silent conference room. He removed several neatly folded pages written in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. Even after 18 years, I recognized the careful block letters he had always used when writing anything important. Mr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses and looked toward all of us. I will read this exactly as it was written. Nobody interrupted. To my family, he began. If you are hearing these words, then time has carried this letter farther than I ever expected. That means something beyond my control delayed what I hoped you would understand while I was still able to explain it myself. I do not know how many years have passed, but I hope you are together as you listen. My mother quietly wiped at the corner of one eye. Hearing my grandfather's words again after so many years felt strangely comforting. Mr. Reynolds continued reading. Every family has a habit of measuring success. Some count dollars. Some count accomplishments. Some count titles. I have learned that the things easiest to count are often the least important. My father lowered his eyes toward the table. Nobody spoke. I have watched my children and grandchildren become adults. Each of them has different strengths, and each deserves to be seen clearly instead of being compared with someone else. Emily slowly looked toward me before returning her attention to the letter. One lesson I hope never disappears from this family is that character grows quietly. Many people overlook quiet people because they mistake silence for weakness. They are almost always wrong. I felt an unexpected tightening in my chest. Those words sounded exactly like the conversations my grandfather and I used to have while walking across his farmland on cool autumn mornings. He always believed the strongest roots grew where nobody thought to look. Mr. Reynolds paused only long enough to turn the page before continuing. If Jacob is old enough to hear this letter, I want him to know something I never found the right moment to say aloud. When I first took him to the county courthouse, I was not trying to teach him about records. I was trying to see whether he noticed people instead of paper. My breathing slowed as memories I had not visited in years returned with remarkable clarity. I remembered asking my grandfather why he smiled whenever he opened old land books. Instead of answering directly, he had asked me to imagine every signature as someone standing beside us telling the story of their life. I had never forgotten that conversation, although I had assumed it was simply another childhood lesson. Apparently, it had meant much more to him. Mr. Reynolds continued. Jacob was the only grandchild who asked about the families behind the documents instead of asking how valuable the land might be. That day I realized his greatest gift was not ambition as the world usually defines it. His gift was stewardship. He understood that protecting the past helps protect people. I glanced toward my father without saying anything. His expression had completely changed. The certainty that usually filled his face had quietly disappeared, replaced by thoughtful silence. The attorney read on. Some people build houses. Others build businesses. Others preserve memories so future generations remember who they are. Every one of those callings deserves respect. The words seemed to settle over the room with surprising weight. I remembered every conversation in which my father had questioned my career, every time he suggested I was settling for less because my work did not produce visible success. Yet here was the man my father admired most saying something entirely different nearly 2 decades earlier. My mother looked at Thomas gently. He did not meet her eyes. Instead, he continued listening without moving. Mr. Reynolds reached the next paragraph. Thomas, if you are hearing this, I hope you remember something I tried to teach you when you first started your construction company. A person should never decide another person's future simply because their path looks unfamiliar. I know you have always wanted the best for your family. Just remember that encouragement grows stronger than comparison. My father closed his eyes for only a brief moment before opening them again. It was the first time I had ever seen him appear genuinely unsettled by words alone. Emily quietly reached over and rested her hand on our mother's shoulder. The attorney continued reading in the same calm voice. There is another reason this letter exists. Along with it, I have prepared an additional document that explains a decision I made after watching my family for many years. That document is not intended to reward success or punish failure. It exists because every family eventually needs someone who values responsibility above recognition. Mr. Reynolds slowly lowered the letter onto the table for a moment, allowing its meaning to settle before speaking again. The remaining pages contain only personal reflections, but this final paragraph appears intended as a transition to the larger document. He turned to the last page. If you have reached this point, then open the enclosed document without interruption. Read every page before drawing conclusions. The first page will surprise you. The final page will explain everything. Above all else, remember that what matters most is not who earned the loudest praise during life, but who quietly carried the greatest responsibility when nobody was watching. The attorney gently folded the letter and returned it to the table. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Even the faint sounds from the busy street outside seemed distant now. My father slowly exhaled before looking at me. There was uncertainty in his eyes, mixed with something I had not seen there in years. Respect. He opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. Mr. Reynolds waited until everyone had absorbed the letter before carefully placing both hands on the larger sealed envelope. Your grandfather believed this explanation should come first, he said quietly. Now we may proceed exactly as he instructed. He broke the seal on the larger envelope, withdrew a thick collection of legal papers bound together with an original blue ribbon, turned to the first page, and after reading only the opening sentence, his expression changed enough for all of us to realize that none of our lives had been built upon the story we believed for the past 18 years. Mr. Reynolds remained silent for several seconds after reading the opening sentence to himself. His expression was not one of shock, but of careful respect, as though he fully understood the weight of what he was about to share. He looked toward each of us before finally speaking. Your grandfather titled this document, Statement of Personal Trust and Family Stewardship. My father frowned slightly. That is not a will. No, Mr. Reynolds answered. It is a legally witnessed declaration intended to accompany his estate documents. It was never meant to replace his will. Instead, it explains the reasoning behind several decisions that were never properly communicated because this file remained sealed. My father slowly leaned back in his chair. I could tell he had expected the conversation to revolve around money or property. Instead, my grandfather had apparently left something far more personal. Mr. Reynolds continued reading. Throughout my life, I have been blessed with children and grandchildren who possess different talents. I do not wish for any of them to become copies of one another because families grow stronger through different gifts. Unfortunately, society often celebrates only the loudest achievements while overlooking quiet responsibility. He paused briefly before reading the next paragraph. For several years, I observed each member of my family without announcing that I was doing so. I watched how they treated strangers. I watched how they responded when no reward was offered. Most importantly, I watched whether they protected things that could never repay them. I felt my heartbeat become noticeably heavier. My grandfather had always been observant, but I had never imagined he had intentionally studied all of us in such a thoughtful way. My mother quietly asked, "He watched all of us?" Mr. Reynolds nodded. According to his own words, yes. Then he continued reading. Character reveals itself most clearly when nobody believes they are being evaluated. Emily looked down at the copy of the letter still resting in front of her. My father remained completely still. The attorney turned another page. I visited my grandchildren separately whenever possible because children often reveal their true priorities during ordinary moments. Some enjoyed competition. Some enjoyed recognition. Some enjoyed accomplishment. Jacob consistently enjoyed helping people preserve memories they believed had been lost. My mind immediately returned to countless afternoons spent helping my grandfather organize old photographs, handwritten family recipes, faded military letters, and weathered land surveys. To me, they had simply been meaningful family moments. Apparently, they had been something more to him. Mr. Reynolds continued. One afternoon, I intentionally misplaced a box containing decades of family photographs. I said nothing and waited. Every person assumed someone else would eventually find it. Jacob spent nearly 3 hours searching the barn because he believed memories should never disappear if they could still be saved. My eyes widened in surprise. I remembered that afternoon perfectly. I had always believed I was simply helping my grandfather recover something important. I had never known he had arranged the situation himself. My father slowly looked toward me. There was no criticism in his expression anymore, only reflection. The attorney continued reading. Another year, I asked each grandchild a simple question. If you discovered an old document with no financial value but great personal meaning to another family, what would you do? Jacob answered immediately that he would return it because some things cannot be replaced with money. Mr. Reynolds lowered the page for just a moment before looking directly at me. Mr. Carter, I suspect you probably do not remember giving that answer. I smiled faintly. No, I do not. Your grandfather did. The room remained completely silent. Mr. Reynolds resumed reading. People sometimes believe success begins when someone notices them. I have learned that success often begins long before anyone is watching. It begins with habits repeated quietly over many years. I noticed my father slowly remove his glasses and rub his eyes before placing them back on. He had spent much of my adult life encouraging me to pursue larger titles, larger salaries, and larger ambitions. Now he was hearing his own father describe success in a completely different language. The attorney turned another page. Thomas has built an honorable business through discipline and determination. Emily possesses remarkable intelligence and financial judgment. Each of them contributes valuable strengths. But responsibility for preserving a family story belongs to someone who naturally understands that people matter more than possessions. My mother softly whispered, "Your father never spoke this way." "Perhaps," Mr. Reynolds replied gently. "He wrote the things he found hardest to say aloud." My father nodded almost imperceptibly. The attorney continued. "For that reason, I prepared additional legal instructions directing that my personal journals, family correspondence, military records, land history, handwritten memoirs, photographs, and historical collections ultimately be entrusted to Jacob when the appropriate time arrived. Not because he is more successful than anyone else, but because I believe he understands their true value." My father looked genuinely stunned. "He left all of that to Jacob?" Mr. Reynolds answered carefully. "According to this document, yes. However, those materials were mistakenly transferred into long-term storage before the instruction could be delivered. The estate itself was settled correctly, but these personal collections remained forgotten inside the sealed archive." I was almost speechless. I had never known my grandfather intended for me to preserve his life's personal history. I would have treasured that responsibility more than any financial inheritance. Mr. Reynolds continued reading. "If my family is hearing this years from now, I hope nobody mistakes this decision for favoritism. Every child deserves equal love. Every grandchild deserves encouragement. This choice reflects responsibility, not preference. The one who protects forgotten stories also protects the family itself." My father slowly lowered his head. For the first time in my life, I realized he had never truly understood why I loved the work I did. He had always believed I settled for a smaller future when, in reality, I had unknowingly followed the path my grandfather recognized long before I understood it myself. Mr. Reynolds carefully turned to the final pages of the declaration. "There is one remaining attachment referenced throughout this document," he said. "It is listed separately because your grandfather considered it the most important piece of evidence supporting every decision he made." He reached inside the large envelope once more and carefully removed a thin folded packet secured with an original notary seal. Across the front, written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting, were 7 simple words that instantly filled the room with even greater anticipation. "Open only after everyone understands why I chose." Mr. Reynolds rested the sealed packet on the table for a long moment before carefully breaking the notary seal. Unlike the previous documents, this packet contained only a few pages, each protected inside a clear archival sleeve. The attorney removed the first page with remarkable care, almost as though he believed the passage of time had increased its importance instead of diminishing it. "Your grandfather identified these pages as supporting evidence," he said quietly. "They were written over several years and witnessed by 2 individuals who are no longer living. Their purpose was not to create legal authority, but to explain the observations behind his decision." He looked toward us before beginning to read. "People often ask how someone learns whom to trust. I have found that trust is rarely built during extraordinary moments. It is built through ordinary days repeated over many years." My grandfather's words immediately transported me back to countless afternoons spent beside him. None of those memories had ever seemed extraordinary at the time. We repaired old picture frames, cleaned dusty bookshelves, organized handwritten recipes, and labeled family photographs together. I had simply enjoyed being with him. Apparently, he had been quietly observing something much deeper. Mr. Reynolds continued. "Many people proudly accept responsibility when others are watching. Fewer people quietly accept responsibility when nobody notices. That difference has become increasingly important to me." He turned another page. "One winter afternoon, I intentionally left my garage unlocked after telling the family I would be away until evening. I wished to see who would check the property after a snowstorm damaged the fence. My father looked surprised. I remember that storm, he said softly. The attorney nodded before continuing. Thomas arrived briefly because he believed someone might attempt to steal equipment. Emily called to ask whether everything was secure. Both acted responsibly. Jacob remained for nearly 4 hours after discovering that melting snow had begun leaking through the roof on his several boxes of old family records. He carefully moved every box before attempting to repair the temporary leak himself. He never mentioned doing so afterward. I blinked in surprise. I remembered that afternoon very clearly. I had not considered it unusual. My grandfather had often helped neighbors without expecting recognition, so doing the same had always felt natural. I never imagined he had intentionally remained silent about it. Mr. Reynolds continued reading. When I thanked Jacob several days later, he appeared confused because he believed protecting family history required no special praise. That answer stayed with me. My father slowly lowered his eyes. My mother quietly smiled through tears. Emily looked toward me with an expression that seemed to combine admiration and disbelief. The attorney reached the next page. Another lesson came unexpectedly during a community history fundraiser. Several valuable antique items were displayed for public viewing. Most visitors admired their financial worth. Jacob spent nearly an hour speaking with an elderly veteran whose faded journal rested unnoticed in a corner display. Later that evening, Jacob asked whether someone had copied the journal so future generations would not lose its stories. Nobody else asked that question. I smiled faintly because I remembered that veteran. His wife had passed away only months earlier, and he had worried that nobody would remember the experiences recorded inside his notebook. I had offered to help preserve it because the stories mattered. I had never realized my grandfather had quietly watched the entire conversation from across the room. Mr. Reynolds looked directly at my father before reading the next paragraph. Thomas, if you ever read these pages, please understand that this decision should never diminish your accomplishments. You have built things I could never have built. But every family also needs someone who protects its memories with the same dedication you protected your business. My father slowly removed his glasses again. This time he held them in both hands while staring silently at the tabletop. Nobody interrupted him. The attorney continued. I worry that future generations may one day inherit houses, savings, and businesses while forgetting the people who sacrificed to create them. Documents preserve facts. Stories preserve identity. Families require both. Every sentence seemed to reinforce something I had quietly believed throughout my career without ever fully explaining it to anyone else. At work, I often told younger employees that preserving records was really about protecting people. Hearing my grandfather express that same belief decades earlier felt strangely comforting. Mr. Reynolds turned to the final page. If this packet is open years after my passing, then Jacob has likely spent much of his adult life believing his interests were misunderstood. I hope this document reminds him that meaningful work does not become meaningful because other people applaud it. It becomes meaningful because it serves others faithfully. My chest tightened as those words settled over me. For years I had questioned whether I should pursue a more impressive career simply to earn my father's approval. Yet every time I considered leaving, something inside me insisted I was exactly where I belonged. Perhaps that quiet certainty had never been mine alone. The attorney folded the final page and carefully returned it to its protective sleeve. No one spoke for what felt like an entire minute. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Instead, it felt respectful, almost sacred. Finally, my father looked toward me. His voice sounded quieter than I had ever heard it. Jacob, I honestly did not know any of this. I answered truthfully. Neither did I. He slowly nodded, his expression filled with regret rather than defensiveness. All these years I believed you had chosen the smaller road because you were afraid to chase something bigger. I shook my head gently. I never saw it that way. I simply found work that mattered to me. My father looked down again before quietly saying, Perhaps I was measuring your life with the wrong ruler. Mr. Reynolds allowed the moment to settle before speaking. There is one final item remaining in your grandfather's recovered file. He reached once more into the large envelope and withdrew a flat leather portfolio secured with an aged brass clasp. Unlike every previous document, this portfolio carried no legal markings, no notary seal, and no official label. Only my grandfather's handwriting appeared across the front. It read, To be given directly to Jacob after everyone understands the difference between success and significance. Mr. Reynolds carefully placed the portfolio in front of me before adding, "Your grandfather instructed that nobody, including this office, was to open it. According to his written directions, only Jacob may read what is inside, but after he does, he alone must decide whether the rest of the family should hear its contents." My hands rested on the leather portfolio for several seconds before I finally lifted it from the polished oak table. The worn leather felt familiar, almost as though my grandfather had carried it for years before deciding it belonged to me. I looked toward Mr. Reynolds. He really wanted only me to read this? The attorney nodded. Those were his exact written instructions. What you choose to share afterward is entirely your decision. I slowly opened the brass clasp. Inside rested a single, handwritten letter and a small black and white photograph. The photograph showed my grandfather standing beside me when I was about 12 years old. We were smiling in front of the county courthouse, each of us holding one side of an old leather-bound record book. I remembered that day immediately. We had spent nearly 6 hours helping volunteers organize historical archives after a basement storage room flooded during a spring storm. At the time, I thought we were simply moving old books from one shelf to another. Looking at the picture now, I realized my grandfather had quietly preserved the memory because it meant far more to him than it ever had to me. I unfolded the letter carefully and began reading in silence. Dear Jacob, if this letter has finally reached you, then many years have passed since I wrote these words. More importantly, it means you have probably spent a long time wondering whether your path was somehow smaller than everyone expected. I hope you never believed that for very long. I paused for a moment before continuing. The world will often celebrate people who build large things because those accomplishments are easy to see. Fewer people recognize those who quietly protect what others forget. Yet history has always depended on both kinds of people. I felt my throat tighten. Every sentence sounded exactly like the conversations we used to have while walking through old cemeteries, abandoned farmhouses, and courthouse archives. He never rushed those conversations. He always wanted me to understand that every family carried stories worth preserving. The letter continued. You may someday wonder whether I expected you to follow this path. The answer is no. I never wanted to choose your future. I only wanted to encourage the qualities I already saw growing inside you. I smiled faintly. My grandfather had never once told me what career I should pursue. He simply exposed me to people whose lives had been shaped by forgotten records, handwritten letters, military journals, family photographs, and preserved history. Without realizing it, I had chosen the same mission on my own. I continued reading. If your work remains unnoticed by many people, do not become discouraged. Quiet service often leaves the deepest mark because it changes lives without seeking recognition. Never confuse applause with purpose. Those words settled deeply inside me. For years I had listened politely whenever people questioned my career. I had even questioned myself from time to time. But sitting there in that conference room, reading my grandfather's own handwriting, I suddenly realized I had spent my adult life chasing purpose instead of approval. Somehow, he had recognized that long before I did. I reached the final page. There is one request I hope you will consider after reading this letter. Do not allow these documents to become a reason for division within the family. If anyone misunderstood your choices, remember that misunderstanding often grows from love expressed imperfectly. Be patient with those who measured success differently than you did. The greatest inheritance I can leave is not these papers. It is the opportunity for my family to understand one another more honestly than before. I lowered the letter slowly. For several moments, I simply stared at the photograph resting beside it. Then I carefully returned both items to the portfolio before closing the clasp. Everyone waited quietly. No one attempted to interrupt. Finally, Mr. Reynolds asked, would you like to keep the contents private, or would you prefer to share them? I looked toward my parents first. My father was watching me with an expression I had never seen before. There was no disappointment, no expectation, only genuine concern about what I had just read. I answered softly. I think my grandfather wanted all of us to understand the same lesson. I would like to share it. I handed the letter to Mr. Reynolds, who carefully read it aloud exactly as it had been written. Nobody spoke during the reading. My mother quietly wiped tears from her cheeks more than once. Emily smiled gently when my grandfather described quiet service. My father remained completely still until the final sentence was read. After several long moments, he slowly stood from his chair. I instinctively began to stand as well, unsure what he intended to say. He looked directly at me, his voice noticeably unsteady. "Jacob, I owe you an apology that should have come years ago." The room remained silent. "I spent so much time encouraging you to become what I thought success looked like that I never stopped to understand what already made your work meaningful." He paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "Every family dinner, every conversation, every piece of advice I gave you came from the belief that I was helping. Looking back now, I realize I was asking you to abandon the very qualities my own father admired most." I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. This was not the father I had become accustomed to defending myself against. This was simply a son discovering something about his own father far too late. He continued quietly. "I called your career small because I judged it by income, titles, and recognition. Your grandfather judged it by service, responsibility, and character. Today I realized he was seeing something I completely missed." I walked around the table until I stood beside him. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I answered with complete honesty. "Dad, I never wanted you to agree with every decision I made. I only hoped one day you would understand why I made them." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with regret. "I understand now, or at least I am finally beginning to." Mr. Reynolds quietly gathered the recovered documents into protective folders while allowing our family the privacy of the moment. As he finished organizing the files, he looked toward us with a gentle smile. "There is one final administrative matter remaining before these records are officially transferred to your family. It concerns a collection your grandfather spent nearly 30 years assembling, and according to these recovered instructions, its future depends entirely upon the decision Jacob makes before all of you leave this office today." Mr. Reynolds closed the final folder containing the recovered documents and gently folded his hands on the conference table before speaking again. "Your grandfather's collection is unlike anything I have encountered during my career," he said. "For nearly 30 years, he gathered journals, family correspondence, military records, property maps, newspaper clippings, handwritten memoirs, church records, photographs, audio recordings, and personal interviews from multiple generations of the Carter family. Everything has been professionally preserved since its recovery." He slid a detailed inventory across the table toward me. I glanced through the pages, and each line revealed another piece of family history I never knew still existed. There were journals written by my great-grandfather during the Great Depression, letters exchanged while relatives served overseas, photographs dating back nearly a century, and handwritten family recipes that had traveled through several generations. It was not simply a collection. It was the story of our family. Mr. Reynolds continued. "Your grandfather instructed that the entire archive be transferred into your care because he believed you would preserve it responsibly. However, he also wrote that you would have complete authority to decide how it should benefit the rest of the family." I looked around the room. My mother quietly studied the inventory with amazement. Emily smiled softly as she recognized several familiar family names. My father remained silent, still processing everything he had learned that afternoon. I slowly closed the inventory and looked at Mr. Reynolds. "May I ask one question?" "Of course." "Did my grandfather ever describe what he hoped would happen after the collection was transferred?" Mr. Reynolds smiled gently. "Yes. In one handwritten note he wrote, 'Memories locked away serve no family. Memories shared become a legacy.'" I lowered my eyes for a moment. Those words immediately made my decision clear. I turned toward my parents and Emily. "I do not want these records to belong only to me." My father looked surprised. "But your grandfather specifically entrusted them to you." I nodded. "He entrusted me with protecting them, not keeping them from everyone else." My mother smiled through fresh tears. Emily quietly whispered, "That sounds exactly like Grandpa." I continued, "I would like every photograph, every journal, every letter, and every recording to be professionally digitized so every member of our family can have access to them. The originals should remain safely preserved, but nobody should lose the opportunity to know where we came from." Mr. Reynolds' expression brightened noticeably. "I believe your grandfather would have been very pleased with that decision." My father slowly leaned back in his chair before speaking. "I have spent years believing success meant holding on to things you earned." He looked directly at me. "Today you reminded me that real success sometimes means making sure everyone else benefits too." I smiled. Grandpa taught us both something today. For the first time since we entered the office, my father returned the smile. It was small, but genuine. Mr. Reynolds carefully organized the legal paperwork necessary to complete the transfer while explaining the preservation process. The archive had already been stored in a climate-controlled facility to protect the original documents. Professional conservators had cleaned fragile papers, restored damaged photographs, and indexed every item according to archival standards. As someone who worked in historical preservation, I understood the enormous effort involved. My grandfather's life's work had survived because complete strangers had treated it with the same respect he always believed forgotten stories deserved. After signing the final transfer forms, Mr. Reynolds handed me a small brass key attached to a leather tag. This opens the private archive room where the original collection is currently stored, he explained. Whenever you are ready, our staff will arrange your first visit. I accepted the key carefully. It felt strangely symbolic. It was not opening a vault of financial wealth. It was opening the history of an entire family. As we gathered our belongings, my father unexpectedly placed one hand on my shoulder. "Would you have dinner with your mother and me tonight?" he asked quietly. The request caught me by surprise because it sounded very different from the conversations we had shared over the past several years. "I would like that," I answered. "There is something I want to say, and I would rather not wait any longer." We thanked Mr. Reynolds for his extraordinary work before leaving the office together. The late afternoon sunlight filled the courthouse square as we stepped outside. Cars moved through downtown traffic, people hurried along the sidewalks, and life continued exactly as it had only a few hours earlier. Yet everything felt different. We drove separately to my parents' house, arriving just before sunset. My mother prepared a simple dinner while Emily helped set the table. Nobody seemed interested in discussing careers, salaries, promotions, or accomplishments anymore. Instead, we found ourselves talking about my grandfather's stories, old family vacations, forgotten neighbors, and childhood memories that none of us had shared in years. During dinner, my father quietly placed his fork on the table. "There is something I need to say in front of everyone." The room became still. He looked directly at me. "For years I believed I was encouraging you by pushing you toward what I thought success should look like. Instead, I made you feel as though your work was never enough. I cannot change those conversations, but I can take responsibility for them." My mother gently reached for his hand. Emily looked at me with a warm smile. I answered honestly, "Dad, hearing you say that means more than you probably realize." He nodded slowly. "Your grandfather saw something in you that I failed to recognize because I was too busy measuring visible achievements. I forgot that the people who quietly preserve a family story are protecting something no amount of money can replace." We continued talking late into the evening, not as people trying to convince one another who had been right, but as a family finally listening without comparison. As I prepared to leave, my father walked with me to my truck. Before I opened the driver's door, he spoke one more time. "Jacob, there is one favor I would like to ask when you finally visit the archive." I looked at him. He smiled with quiet humility. "Would you let me come with you? I think it is time I learned the stories my father spent his entire life trying to preserve." 3 months later, my father and I stood together inside the climate-controlled archive room where my grandfather's collection had finally been transferred into my care. Tall shelving units stretched across the room, each carefully labeled and filled with acid-free storage boxes containing decades of our family's history. Professional archivists had restored every fragile document, cataloged every photograph, and preserved every handwritten journal with extraordinary care. As I unlocked the first cabinet using the small brass key Mr. Reynolds had given me, I looked toward my father. He smiled quietly before saying, "I spent years believing the most valuable things a family could pass down were businesses, savings, and property. I never imagined I would stand in a room like this feeling richer than I ever have." I handed him a pair of archival gloves before opening the first storage box. Inside rested the journals my great-grandfather had written during the Great Depression. The pages described difficult harvests, neighbors helping one another through hard winters, and ordinary acts of kindness that kept families together when life became uncertain. My father carefully turned each page with remarkable patience. Every few minutes he would stop reading and simply sit in silence, allowing the words to settle. We spent nearly 6 hours inside the archive that day, not because we hurried through the collection, but because we slowed down enough to appreciate every story. Some documents made us smile. Others reminded us how much previous generations had sacrificed so future generations could enjoy opportunities they never had. As we prepared to leave, my father looked at me and quietly said, "Your grandfather did not leave us a collection of papers. He left us instructions for how to remember who we are." That sentence stayed with me long after we locked the archive room. During the following months, I worked with a professional digitization team to preserve every photograph, journal, letter, and recording. Emily volunteered to help organize family names and dates, while my mother spent weekends identifying relatives in old photographs that none of us could recognize. Even my father began visiting every Saturday morning, often arriving with another forgotten story that helped explain the people appearing inside the records. For the first time in many years, our conversations no longer revolved around careers or accomplishments. Instead, we talked about legacy, gratitude, perseverance, and the importance of remembering the ordinary people whose quiet decisions shaped our family long before we were born. Nearly a year after discovering the forgotten documents, we organized our first Carter Family Heritage Day at the local historical society where I worked. We invited cousins, nieces, nephews, neighbors, and younger relatives who had never seen the collection before. Large digital displays allowed everyone to explore family photographs, recorded interviews, military records, handwritten memoirs, and restored newspaper articles. Children listened with wide eyes as older relatives shared stories that had nearly disappeared forever. My father spent almost the entire afternoon standing beside one display featuring my grandfather. More than once I overheard him telling younger family members, "Do not make the mistake I made. Never judge another person's future by the title on a business card. Character always grows before recognition does." Every time I heard those words, I quietly smiled because I knew how difficult they had once been for him to say. My own career also continued to grow in unexpected ways. After leading several successful preservation initiatives, I was promoted to Director of Community Archives for the Regional Foundation. The promotion brought greater responsibility, additional staff, and opportunities to help preserve thousands of historical records across several counties. When my father heard the news, he congratulated me warmly, but what he said next mattered even more. "Jacob," he told me, "I am proud of your promotion, but I want you to know something. I became proud of you long before this happened. I simply did not understand it at the time." Those words meant more to me than any title I could ever receive. Looking back now, I realized the forgotten document had never changed who I was. It changed how my family finally understood the path I had already been walking for years. The greatest gift my grandfather left behind was not a collection of journals, letters, or photographs. It was the opportunity for a father and son to replace years of quiet misunderstanding with honest respect. Today, the archive continues growing as each generation contributes its own stories, photographs, and memories. Every Thanksgiving, our family gathers for dinner, and before dessert, someone always shares one story from the collection. Sometimes it is humorous. Sometimes it is deeply moving. Sometimes it simply reminds us that ordinary lives often leave extraordinary legacies. My father now insists on telling the younger children why preserving those stories matters. He often smiles before repeating the lesson his own father quietly tried to teach him many years ago. Success is measured by what people notice. Significance is measured by what remains after you are gone. Whenever I hear him say those words, I think back to that Sunday evening when I left my parents' house believing I would always be the son whose future disappointed them. I had no idea that one forgotten document would not change my destiny, because my destiny had never been lost. Instead, it revealed a truth that had been patiently waiting through the years until the right moment arrived. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money, property, or recognition. Sometimes it is finally being seen for who you have quietly been all along, and discovering that the people who once misunderstood you are willing to learn, to grow, and to walk beside you with a deeper understanding than either of you thought possible.